When a new player first discovers Magic the Gathering, the first thing that will typically resonate with them are the creature types. Everybody who knows anything about fantasy will know what an elf, a dwarf, or a vampire is. Talk to any veteran player about creature types and they'll inevitably bring up one of the only ones that is completely unique to Magic, the Slivers. The Sliver hive mind are one of, if not the strongest creature type the game has ever seen. They're unique in that every Sliver in play will share its abilities with each other Sliver. Their unique appearance and flavor is a large part in why I've been playing Magic for so long. My first Commander deck was a Sliver deck, before it was even called Commander. I've been playing Slivers for so long that a lot of the copies in my Commander deck are in Japanese. One, it looks cool, and B, I'd never need to read these cards. I know exactly what their names are and exactly what they do. On the surface, Slivers look like they have a really obvious play pattern. If they're all gonna share abilities, you might as well just dump your entire hand onto the board and swing for 1,000,000 damage. That used to be a completely viable strategy, but Commander decks have gotten so good that it's actually a little bit more complicated than that these days. You might be thinking about the pre-constructed deck from Commander Masters that featured the Sliver Gravemother that came out a couple of years ago. While I do think that deck was crucial to introducing new players to the Slivers, I think it also showcased how complicated it actually is to build a good Sliver deck. Today, I want to take you through my approach on how to build Slivers for the modern era. Before you ask, no, we're not going for CEDH here. We're going for casual Commander with plenty of consistency to hold its own against pretty much any strategy. Also, before we get started, I did want to point out that Slivers aren't a super budget-friendly option. A lot of the Slivers are cheap, but the Commanders are pretty expensive for the most part, and a lot of the support that you want is on the pricier side. I'm going to try to add budget cards where I can, I just wanted you to keep that in mind. Let's do it. As I said before, a lot of Slivers in a vacuum these days feel pretty overcosted for what they actually do for you. So the first thing I want to focus on is a mana base, because that needs to be consistent before anything else. Traditionally, you'll see a lot of Slivers players running 10 fetch lands, 10 shock lands, 2 of each basic land, and a bunch of lands that can tap for any color. That traditional land base still can work, but it has problems. Fetch lands have you pay 1 life in order to actually use them, and if you need the shock lands to come in untapped, you're taking 2 life. If you start the game off with 3 fetch lands in your hand and crack them for 3 shock lands, you're taking 9 life before you even really have a board presence. Thankfully, I've figured out a secret sauce workaround in order to get your colors as fast as you can without taking too much life. A majority of the best creature support is in green, so we're going to make a deck that is primarily green with the other 4 colors being used as support. There's also only one mono-colored card that has more than 1 colored pip in it in the entire deck. So once you get the colors that you need, you can basically play multiple cards a turn without worrying about whether or not you have enough white mana to do so or whatever. Let's take a look at our land base one more time. We can make this mana base a lot smoother by cutting 5 of our least important shock lands and replacing those with triomes. I added Zagoth Triome, Ketria Triome, Spara's Headquarters, Zayator's Proving Ground, and Chetmir's Garden. That way, any of our fetch spells and fetch lands can fetch basically any color that we would need. Speaking of any color, our lands that tap for all 5 are Command Tower, Exotic Orchard, Path of Ancestry, Fabled Passage, either Unclaimed Territory or Secluded Courtyard. The slight difference doesn't actually matter in this deck, and of course, the Sliver Hive. I fully acknowledge that this land base is pretty expensive. If you're on a budget, I would recommend running basic lands, bounce lands, check lands, and the lair cycle, as well as any 5 color lands that you can get your hands on. Cavern of Souls and 3 Tree City are also obvious picks, but I personally am running 36 lands in my deck, but you could go up to 38 if you're more comfortable with that. Adding to our mana base, we also have a few mana rocks in this deck. Now, of course, Sol Ring and Arcane Signet are going to be auto-includes in most decks, as well as Chromatic Lantern since we're running 5 colors. I also added Pillar of Origin to make our Slivers a little easier to cast. Now that that's out of the way, let's move on to the fun part. We're going to talk Slivers. There are 116 unique Slivers in all of Magic. Obviously, we're not going to be running all of those. In any solid creature-based deck, you're going to want to run about 35 to 40 creatures. I personally am running 39 Slivers in my deck. But let's start with the commander, because that actually decides a lot more than you would expect from this creature type. There are 6 possible commanders to choose from when you go to build a Sliver deck. Each one of them taps for Wooburg, or one of any color of mana. 3 of these commanders present a pretty easy to follow go wide strategy. The other 3 can also go wide, but they're at their best when you make unique deck building decisions based on these commanders specifically. I personally think the best Sliver commander right now is the first Sliver. Its unique ability to cascade makes it a lot easier to rebuild your board after something like a Blasphemous Edict hits the table. Of course, he's pretty expensive these days, and you can't really go wrong with any of them. So if you're on a budget, go with Sliver Hivelord. Giving all of your Slivers indestructible is a super powerful way to get them to stick. Before we keep going, check and see if you're subscribed. It really helps out small channels like mine. And if you want to see Magic and other nerdy content on your feed more often, I'd love to have you stick around. Alright, let's get back to it. As I said before, there are 116 Slivers. So how do you decide which ones go in the deck? These are the ones that I would consider absolutely essential to any Sliver build. First up are the Mana Dorks. Gemhide Sliver and Mana Weft Sliver turn all of your Slivers into Birds of Paradise. I don't think I need to explain why that is super good in a 5-color creature deck. The next essential set are the Sliver Lords. We have Muscle Sliver, Sinew Sliver, and Predatory Sliver that give all of your different Slivers +1/+1. I've been able to win games with just one of these on board. If you have all 3, it's pretty much game over. You can also add Megantic Sliver to this list, but I don't think he's an auto-include. He's literally the cost, power and toughness, and abilities of all 3 of the other ones combined. Another absolutely essential Sliver in modern Magic is Quick Sliver. It gives all of your Slivers flash. Giving your creatures flash is so important when you're trying to play around board wipes or basically give them pseudo haste, as if you play them on your opponent's end step and it goes to your turn, suddenly you can attack with all the Slivers that you just played. Crystalline Sliver has been an auto-include since the very birth of the creature type. Giving all of your Slivers Shroud means your opponents are going to have to deal with the entire hive if they want to take even one of your Slivers down. Next, from the same cycle Crystalline Sliver was from, we have Hibernation Sliver. This one lets you pay 2 life to return any Sliver to your hand. So if your opponent does have the opportunity to try to kill one of your important Slivers with spot removal, you can just pay 2 life and essentially negate that. Next up is the Cloud Shredder Sliver. This Sliver gives all of your others flying and haste, which is absolutely insane for 2 mana. We have Wing Sliver and Gale Rider Sliver that give flying, and Heart Sliver and Blur Sliver that give haste, but this one gives them both for only 2 mana. Finally, we have what I would argue is the most important one out of this bunch, and that's Harmonic Sliver. Harmonic Sliver lets you destroy any artifact or enchantment every time a Sliver comes onto the field. With all of the absolutely busted enchantments and artifacts that are around these days, being able to clear those out when they're normally pretty hard to get rid of is absolutely amazing. I don't think these next ones are essential, but they are some of my favorites. Root Sliver prevents itself and any other Sliver that you play from being countered. Next is Shifting Sliver, which essentially gives them all horsemanship. Slivers can only be blocked by Slivers. Finally, we have Ward Sliver. It not only has my favorite piece of Sliver art, being able to protect your creatures from a single color is huge depending on the pod that you're playing with. Let's talk about a few synergies to watch out for while you're building your Sliver deck. There's a good argument to be had that Crypt Sliver is absolutely essential to any Sliver deck as well. Being able to tap and regenerate any one of your other Slivers is huge, but with Crystalline Sliver giving all of your Slivers Shroud, that becomes a non-bow, so just watch out for that. For the budget players, if you're running Sliver Hivelord as your commander, and you have Spiteful Sliver in play, casting a Blasphemous Act goes from a pretty good board wipe to an absolute blowout. If you have the money to run Sliver Queen as your commander and have a Heartstone and a Basalt Sliver in play, you have infinite mana. If you're running Sliver Overlord, his best friend is Amoeboid Changeling. Amoeboid Changeling can turn any of your opponent's creatures into a Sliver, and then Sliver Overlord can just steal them. Heartstone is also extremely good with Sliver Overlord as well. Of course, once you pick your your Sliver commander, you can run as many of the other ones in the 99. I personally would only stick to about 3 of them, as any more can make draws kind of awkward. I would also avoid adding too many high-costed Slivers into your deck, period. No matter which commander you're playing, your late game is to go wide, not go big. I recommend keeping most of your Slivers and most of your mana curve in general around 2 or 3 if you're building this deck. And a lot of the higher costed Slivers share abilities with lower costed Slivers anyway. Why would you play Ground Shaker Sliver when you can just play Horned Sliver and 2 other Slivers for the same amount of mana? Now that we've picked out some Slivers, how do you play them? Of course you want to play your Slivers, but what happens if something goes wrong? Play 1 Sliver and then have a counterspell up to make it stick. In my opinion, they're more of a toolbox creature type. If there are no artifacts or enchantments in play, hold the Harmonic Sliver in your hand until you actually need it. Also, everybody at the table already knows that Slivers are terrifying, so play conservatively and don't make yourself the archenemy right away. We have our creatures and our mana base, but before we decide what else goes into the deck, let's take a look at what Slivers aren't good at. The main reason why I think the first Sliver is the best commander for Slivers these days is because they're not particularly good at rebuilding after board wipes. Like I said, a lot of them are overcosted in a vacuum, but the first Sliver actually uses that to its advantage by cascading. Speaking of rebuilding, there's not many ways to get Slivers out of the graveyard once they're in there. Obviously, the Sliver Gravemother was designed to fill that role, but it's not particularly efficient at it. The final hole that we need to fill in this Sliver deck is card draw. Synapse Sliver is the only Sliver that supports efficient card draw, but he costs 5, so he's at the end of our curve. Let's start filling these gaps, starting with the artifacts. Besides the mana rocks that we listed earlier, our goals with the artifacts are cost reduction and ways to draw. Herald's Horn is extremely good in basically any typal deck, and since we have 35 to 40 Slivers in our deck, most of the time it's letting us draw an extra card every turn. Next, because all of our Slivers only have a single color pip, Urza's Incubator is absolutely insane in this deck. This isn't a budget card by any means, but if you have Coat of Arms, it'll literally end the game when you play it. A card that I think is absolutely essential to any Sliver deck is Vanquisher's Banner. If you can get it out early, you're going to be drawing cards so often and going to have a very high powered board very fast. There's a couple of other artifacts I wanted to point out as well as possible options. Symmetry Matrix is a cool one. I think it's a little bit expensive, but since every single Sliver is pretty much symmetrical, you are always drawing a card. If you want a Coat of Arms effect on a little bit more of a budget, Door to Destinies is a really solid option there. And as I mentioned before, if you're running Sliver Queen or Sliver Overlord as your commander, there is no reason why you shouldn't be running Hearthstone. Next up, let's talk about enchantments. I think this is one of the more flexible card types in this deck, but like I said, I've been playing Slivers for a long time and have come up with a essentially perfect package of enchantments. Descendant's Path is an absolutely amazing way to build up your board, and goes particularly insane in first Sliver lists. One Sliver off the top can turn into an entire army if they also have Cascade, and if you have Herald's Horn on top of that, you're allowed to stack those triggers however you want. If you're watching this on a budget and are wondering what one card I personally would splurge on, it would be Guardian Project. Since the only stipulation with Guardian Project is that each of your creatures has a different name, you're drawing a card just for playing any Sliver in your deck. It might net you less cards over time than something like Kindred Discovery, but this is primarily a green deck, so you can get this out really fast. Next is Reflections of Lityara. For 5 mana, you're effectively copying every single Sliver that you play, so this is going to end the game really fast. The last card on my essential enchantments list is Rhythm of the Wild. This card is like 3 different Sliver abilities all in one package. Suddenly, your Slivers can't be countered, and each one of them enters the battlefield with either a 1/1 counter on them or haste. This can make Slivers absolutely impossible to deal with, even if you don't have a ton of them on board. Another enchantment that I'm running but I don't necessarily think is essential is Steely Resolve. This thing is essentially a second copy of Crystalline Sliver in your deck, and you really can't beat that for the cost. If you're running Sliver Queen or Sliver Overlord as your commander, I also think Training Grounds is absolutely essential. Reducing the ability cost by 2 of either of these commanders is, we'll look at it, it's absolutely insane. If you absolutely cannot get your hands on a Guardian project, Beast Whisperer is actually a really solid alternative. It's not a sliver and can die a whole lot easier, but it is doing essentially the same thing. Next up, let's talk about the sorceries. Our first priority with sorceries is to fetch our lands. Farseek, Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, Nature's Lore, and 3 Visits are all really good in this deck. Nature's Lore and 3 Visits particularly are great because we're running the triomes that have green in them, so you can essentially search for all of your colors with just these 2 spells. Farseek can search for literally any land in the deck besides our basic forests, and Cultivate and Kodama's Reach are there to fill out our basics as well. Our next goal is to wipe the board. Blasphemous Act is the obvious pick here, especially with the synergy of Sliver Hithelord and Spiteful Sliver that I mentioned earlier. Spells like Kindred Dominance are also really good options as you pick a creature type and obviously you're picking slivers, but it's pretty expensive and also has double pips. Speaking of double pips, I highly recommend running Patriarch's Bidding. This is the card that I mentioned as the only card in the deck with double pips as a monocolored card. But I think it's fine here because if you're casting a Patriarch's Bidding, you're essentially ending the game, especially if your opponents have wiped the board a few times. A couple of budget sorceries that I recommend are Distant Melody, which if you have a board full of slivers is going to draw you a ton of cards, and Epheto Dredging, so if you don't have a Patriarch's Bidding, you can still get some of your slivers back. Finally, let's wrap things up by talking about the instants. This is the last card type because there's no planeswalkers that really make sense for this deck, and I still don't know how battles work. Swords to Plowshares and Path to Exile, I would argue, are essential for this deck. 1 white mana to get rid of any creature that is potentially stopping your game plan is huge. Beast Within and Generous Gift are both amazing options as well. I wouldn't hesitate putting both of them in the deck. Obviously, Beast Within is going to be a little bit easier to cast with all the green mana that we have, but they're both amazing. I know it's probably obvious to a lot of you in a 5-color deck, but it's good to remind you that you probably want some counterspells. You have access to blue mana, and you have a bunch of opponents that are going to want to take you down, so you're definitely going to want some interaction that way too. If you have the budget for it, 2 obvious suites of cards that you could include are both Protection and Tutors. Spells like Heroic Intervention and Teferi's Protection are obviously amazing for keeping your stuff on the board. And most of the tutors are going to be obvious, but one that I wanted to point out is Eladamri's Call. For 1 white and a green, you can search for any sliver in your deck at instant speed. This is going to be amazing in finding the silver bullet for your opponents, so I would also recommend maybe splurging on this too if you can. And that about wraps it up. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you give Slivers a try if you haven't. My deck list is going to be in the description below, as well as the like and subscribe button if you could hit those, please. Thanks again. I'll see you next time. I have been Foxherder, and you have been wonderful.